We begin this morning by we've been looking at some of the different sermons that are presented in the book of Acts, and what we are looking at this morning is a sermon that Paul presented in Acts chapter 17. So we entitled this lesson, Preaching with Paul. So Acts chapter 17, Paul is going to be in Athens. We're going to note a few things about it, about what his sermon was, but there are a few things that we want to note as way of an introduction. And what we really want to focus on this morning is the idea of being able to relate to other people, especially being able to relate to other people that we might not have a lot in common with. And I can say that personally, this is something that I have to work on a lot, trying to relate to people that I may not have the same interest in. It can be a difficult thing to do. So it can be difficult to relate to people that are different from us. I think about an episode of an old TV show. I know Dad's referenced it before, but a TV show called The Twilight Zone. And there was an episode in that series where, and the episode was called Equality of Mercy. And the episode opened up with an American soldier during the latter stages of World War II, and they had the opportunity to take a camp of the Japanese, but the camp was composed of essentially injured soldiers or people that had been afflicted with disease. So they didn't really pose a threat, but there was the opportunity to take the camp. And the main character, the protagonist, wanted to go in and to kill all the inhabitants of the camp because he was focused on killing the enemy. Even though they were dying from disease, dying from their injuries, he wanted to go ahead and kill them. And what happened, and again, the show is goes into the supernatural a little bit. The guy has some type of dream or something, but it puts him in the shoes of a Japanese soldier. And in this dream that he's having, the Japanese soldier is essentially faced with the same task that he is, but looking at the Americans. And in that dream, he is a Japanese soldier, and he is looking at the fact that the Japanese have the opportunity to come to an American camp and to kill their soldiers who are dying from disease and dying from their injuries. And instead of going in and killing them, he is pleading to the Japanese officer, saying to have mercy on them. And then, which is a stark change in mind. And then he wakes up from that dream, and then he realizes that, he and the enemy, at least to a certain degree, have a little bit of ground that is common. They have a little bit in common together in terms of not going in and, he sort of comes to his realization, we might could say, not to hurt soldiers that are injured and already dying of their injuries. And so he learns that he has common ground. He can, in a sense, kind of relate in a way to some of those Japanese soldiers that he was fighting. But that just goes to show sometimes it can be difficult to find ground that we may have in common with other people. And really, what we're going to look at this morning in Acts 17 is that Paul shows us a really good example of how we can either identify or we can relate to other people that maybe are not Christians, that we don't have a lot in common with. And this is personally one of my favorite, sermons to read in the book of Acts, because I think Paul does a very good job with it. So let's look in our Bibles, Acts chapter 17. We're going to break this section down into three main sections from verses 16 down through verse 31. First, we're going to talk about how, as Christians, we can cast or throw a wide blanket, which is sort of what Paul does in the chapter as a whole, but Paul's also going to do it when he comes to the city of Athens. He's going to cast a wide blanket in terms of who he's talking to. We're also going to see the importance of how a Christian can listen to others, and how that helps us to be able to relate to people that maybe we don't have a lot in common with. Paul's going to do a very good job of showing us how that's important. And then finally, the final point, sort of tying in with the overall theme again, that a Christian can acknowledge how we can find common ground with other people. Paul's going to do that in large part with how he constructs his sermon that's recorded for us in verses 23, but especially verses 24 down through verse 31. So we begin this morning by looking at how we as Christians can throw a wide blanket. We keep in mind that this was God's purpose for Paul. His purpose, again, was to cast or to throw a wide blanket. We talked about this last week, Acts chapter 9, when Saul is converted, he later becomes Paul. When he's converted, before he's converted, Ananias is told by God that he was to go preach to Paul because Paul was going to be God's ambassador to the Gentiles. He's going to be one of the main apostles that goes and preaches to the Gentiles, which is what he does. If you look at Acts chapter 10, verses 34 through 35, we recall Peter in that passage is preaching to Cornelius. And we know that Peter had a struggle in terms of going and preaching to the Gentiles. So much so that God gave him a vision to try to explain things to him. But in Acts chapter 10, verses 34 through 35, Peter recognizes that God also wants Cornelius to be saved. And that's why Peter then goes on to say in that passage, "Of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but he that worketh fear and righteousness is accepted of him," no matter what nation. Acts 10, verses 34 through 35, Peter comes to that realization. That's what Paul's purpose really was. It's no longer just casting a blanket to try to bring together the Jews into Christ, but it's also going to bring the Gentiles together as well. Paul understood that. That's what he's doing in Acts chapter 17. The chapter begins off with Paul in Thessalonica. Paul goes and we read in verse 1 that he goes to the synagogue of the Jews, and you might think that maybe that's all who Paul converts in the city. But you go down to verse 4, the text reads for us that some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, talking about the Jews, but then of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. So in this passage, in this chapter, Paul has already cast a wide net, both Jew and Gentile. Well, we come to Acts 17, where Paul is in Athens. You see the same thing. Verse 17, "Therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him." So Paul was not content essentially just going into the synagogue and preaching. He was content with anyone that he encountered within the city to talk about Christ, to talk about the Bible. And in that way, Paul was casting a wide blanket. Right? I cannot relate to other people that I don't understand if I'm not willing to cast that wide blanket, to be willing to step out maybe of my own comfort zone and to be able to talk to people that I don't know very well about the Bible, people that I might not have a lot of interest with. I can't hope to relate to them if I don't have the desire to cast that wide blanket. I've got Romans 15, 15, and 16 up there as well. That's where Paul in the book of Romans, we'll get to it later in Bible class, but again, Paul's just going to reemphasize that he was the ambassador. He was one of the chief preachers of the gospel in terms of being directed to them to go and to teach them the gospel, which is what he does, which is what he's doing essentially in Acts chapter 17. We go on and we see that not only is he talking to maybe the average everyday person, but verses 18 through 21, he's encountering some people that are very different from him. Verse 18, the text reads for us, "Then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him, and some said, 'What will this babbler say?' Others said, 'He seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection.' And they took him and brought him unto Areopagus, saying, 'May we know that this new doctrine whereof thou speakest is? For thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know, therefore, what these things mean. For all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else, but either to tell or to hear some new thing.'" Now, Luke is recording this. This is not something that Paul, who grew up as again, he was trained under the law of Moses, trained under Gamaliel. This is something that is a little bit foreign to Paul in terms of what these people are doing here. The Epicureans and the Stoics, they were considered some of the most intelligent men of the time. And Paul, of course, is an intelligent man, but he was intelligent in the law of Moses. These people are intelligent in things that are not concerning the law of Moses. And this, in large part, ties into a lot of the Greek culture, which Paul, to a certain extent, may not have been very familiar with. But yet we see Paul going forth and casting such a wide blanket that now he's got the opportunity to speak to these very intelligent individuals, but intelligent in a little bit different way maybe than what he is. And that really leads us to the question, in light of what Paul is sort of setting the stage for here, how wide is the net that we cast as Christians? How wide is the net or the blanket that we throw to, not to entrap people, but to try to talk to them or teach them about Christ? Because I think about that, I think about the example of the Pharisees. Luke chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. We know Luke 15, I think in large part because of the parable of the prodigal son, and we're sort of getting ahead of ourselves, at least in terms of the study of the parables right now, but it is a good example to talk about this. But the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, all three of those parables began by what Jesus observed with the actions of the Pharisees in relation to the people that had gathered around Jesus to hear him speak. And if you would, turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 15, because I do want to read both of those verses. Because essentially what Jesus is going to get after the Pharisees in this passage concerns with their unwillingness to cast a wide net. Luke chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Then drew near unto him all the publicans and sinners for to hear him. And the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, This man receiveth sinners and eateth with them. And you know that going forward, these parables have to do with finding something that is lost. Whether it's the sheep that is lost that is found, whether it's the coin that is lost and is found, whether it's the son that goes away and is found, and then the older brother has a wrong attitude about finding the lost son. All of these parables go back to these two verses that essentially Jesus is calling out the Pharisees for not caring about the sinners that he was trying to save. They were not casting a wide enough net. And if you want a good visual representation of this, there's a TV show called The Chosen. And I don't endorse everything in it because they do have some things that are incorrect, but they do a really good job of showing the level of disdain that the Pharisees and some of the religious leaders had for the common person in that day. Well, Jesus here in Luke 15 is calling them out for that. You have not cast a wide enough net. Your blanket is not wide enough. Paul understood that in Acts 17. That's why he is encountering and talking to people that generally you would not think that a Jewish Christian would do that. But he's doing that very thing, throwing a wide blanket. Not only is he doing that in Acts 17, but he's also making sure that he listens to what they have to say, or at least observing what they have to say. Paul observed what went on in Athens. And the focus of that is verses 16. We go back to verse 16. We didn't read it earlier, but it is important to note verse 16. It says, Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. Now you know that Paul is waiting, and you go back to verse 15, he's waiting on Silas and Timothy. But while he's waiting in Athens, we come to verses 22 and 23. We get a better sense of what he was doing while he was waiting. Verse 22, when they brought him to Mars Hill, Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. And you might think that if Paul perceives this, he doesn't really have a good estimation of the facts. He maybe is making a quick judgment about the people if he's only perceiving this. But you know verse 23, For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with the inscription to the unknown God. Verse 23, Paul demonstrates that he's not making a quick assessment. I passed by, I beheld, I took in, I observed, I witnessed, I listened to what was going on in the city. And because of that, Paul has the opportunity to make a better assessment, a better judgment about who the Athenians are and what type of religion that they practice. He listened to others. And that brings a question to us, how often do we listen or observe the actions and maybe the religious beliefs of others? It's one thing to go in to talk to people about the Bible, and maybe you give them the opportunity to talk and to give them the opportunity to state what they believe. And it's very easy to go through that process and simply just listen. Maybe you're going through the process and you're hearing what they're saying, but you're not actively listening to what they're saying. Maybe you're thinking about, how you're thinking about other things. Maybe you're not focused solely on what they're saying. As we'll talk about in a moment, that doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything that they say, but maybe you're not giving them the full attention that they deserve, but you still think that you're listening to them. Well, that's not the idea of listening. If you want to be able to convert somebody, you've got to show interest in what they believe. You don't have to agree with it, but you've got to show an interest in where they're coming from. And that's what Paul is trying to do, really. Verses 22 through 23, Paul comes from a very different culture than the Athenians, but he begins his sermon by saying, I'm not making a judgment, a hasty judgment. I'm not making an uninformed decision here. I've observed what went on. I've listened to what essentially your religion is taught. I'm sort of laying out the facts as it compares to Christianity here. So Paul observed what went on. That's how we can better relate to others. We need to know and we need to show genuine concern about what they believe, even though we may not agree with it. And Paul shows that by avoiding making quick judgments in verses 17 and verse 23. And so in light of that, Paul now has a better form of understanding. Again, if Paul comes in here and simply throws out accusations about what the Athenians believed, and those accusations are not correct, or maybe he mixes them up between the different groups, maybe they have a right to come at him and attack him for that because he has not shown genuine interest, but because Paul has accurately and with great concern observed what has gone on, Paul has a better form of understanding, which leads him to preach a message that gets across to the people and makes, in large part, a lot of sense for us. But it also is going to make sense for a lot of people that would convert, that are given it at the end of the passage. So Paul has a better form of understanding. And then we come to point number 3. We see we see that how Paul, at this point, now he can acknowledge that there is common ground. And we're going to break this down a little bit further in terms of reading it. But verses 24 through 31, Paul again is sort of showing that in this sermon I've observed what is said. Now I can talk about where we have common ground and begin that way. Verses 24 through 26. And the text says that God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worship with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds of their habitation. Now, I want to go back and say that in verses 22 through 23, Paul calls them superstitious. Some people might think that that's an insult. That's not what Paul is saying here. The idea of superstitious sometimes just meant the idea of being extremely religious. Paul was acknowledging that these people, it's not the idea that they lack fervor. Sort of like what Paul was saying about the Jews. It's not because you lack zeal. It's just you don't have zeal according to knowledge. You're very religious, but Paul's going to try to direct that zeal in the proper channel. So many gods that they built an altar to the unknown God. Paul now is saying he's not giving them it's not an idea of an insult here, but Paul's trying to find common ground by beginning talking about this unknown God that they are worshiping. And Paul, in the first point within this section, Paul again emphasizes that we don't have to abandon biblical principles. We don't have to compromise biblical teaching when we're trying to find common ground with other people, right? Because Paul begins by talking about that God does not dwell in temples. Well, we've been talking about in class, you can study in the history of the ancient Roman Empire, that they believed that gods dwelled in temples, or they believed that they had idolatry in temples. They had figures. They had idols. And what we see in the Old Testament, they had a lot of those same idols in the Roman Empire. That's different. Paul's not saying that that's acceptable, or Paul's not saying that that's a proper way to worship God. Verse 24, he says, God does not dwell in temples made with hands. He's not worshipped with men's hands. We know in the book of Acts that Paul got in trouble in, I believe, the city of Ephesus because he hurt the work of a man named Demetrius and other people that made their living by building idols, crafting them. People in the marketplace that profited off the sale of meat that were offered to idols, they had a problem with Paul too. Paul's not saying, he's not trying to justify what their work is. He does point out here that, God is not worshiped with men's hands, or the idea of having to build idols to him or to offer physical sacrifices in that sense. That's no longer necessary. It says, verse 26, God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. One of the things that you begin to study and you begin to notice about the Romans is that they had a lot of interesting ideas about the people that were not citizens of the Roman Empire. Sometimes the Roman authorities looked down on people that did not observe their traditions. A lot of times the Jews in Palestine were looked down, and sometimes they were persecuted because of their beliefs. The Romans often called those that were outside of the empire barbarians. They had the idea that they were, in a way, superior to the peoples of other nations, to the peoples that didn't observe their traditions. But Paul's not going to compromise the biblical teaching that God has now opened the door for all nations to be to have the ability to be saved. Verse 26, he's made of one blood all nations of men. Whereas sometimes the Romans emphasize their superiority, Paul is simply stating here that God, in reality, has made all men part of the most important nation that was ever constructed, which is the church, the kingdom of God. So Paul does not compromise on biblical teaching to find common ground. He sticks to it. But we know where he begins to find common ground, verse 27. And that's because we all share a common experience when we are apart or separate from God. And this is actually a message of encouragement rather than, say, Romans 3:23, talking about how we are all under sin. Verse 27, Paul says that they should seek the Lord if haply they might feel after him and find him. But note this phrase, though he be not far from every one of us. Now, how encouraging is that people from so different of backgrounds still have the same access, still are essentially at the same distance apart from God. They still have the same opportunities. It's not like one culture had to do more than another to be accepted by God at this point. Everyone is the same distance from God. He is not far from every one of us. Now, sometimes the Athenians and some of these Greek thinkers sometimes emphasize, physical locations of gods. We may think about Mount Olympus, the residing place that was often attributed to the gods. Paul's just emphasizing here, God's not far from every one of us in the sense that, the opportunity for salvation, it's the same for everybody, and it's not that difficult to follow, right? It's very simple. The Bible's laid it out very simple. Paul's going to lay that out very simply. And that's a message of encouragement that at the end of the day, we all start on common ground because we are apart from God. But that distance from God is the same for everybody, and it's not that far in terms of how to be obedient to God. Verses 28 through 29, not only do we start on that common ground, but we also have a common relationship by nature to God. Verses 28 through 29. Paul says, for in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone graven by art and man's device. Again, we are the offspring of God. This is just talking about in a pure physical sense. Going back to Genesis chapter 1, we are created in the image of God. We have we have a soul, right, in that sense. We have the ability to choose between good and evil. God has made us in his image in that sense. We have the opportunity, we have a soul, we have the opportunity to be obedient to him. And Paul emphasizes that in verses 28 through 29. Verse 28, Paul's essentially saying, you haven't been right on everything, but at least in one sense, maybe you are somewhat right here. Or it's really not all that different from what you believe. As one of your own poets have said, for in him we live and move and have our being. That we don't exist if it's not for the fact that God exists. The Greeks believe that. Paul's saying we've got common ground here in this. And so Paul can relate in that sense because he's observed what has went on, and now he has found that common ground that he can relate to other people. We're not all that different And then verses 30 through 31, we can know that everyone shares a common end when they are apart from God, or a common end in God. Verses 30 through 31, the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he hath raised him from the dead. There is the recognition of judgment, right? Verse 30, judgment's coming, the times of ignorance, the things, even though that you've practiced all these things, maybe there is a little bit of common ground, it's time to put that away. It's time to finally be obedient to Christ, because there is coming a day of judgment in which the world will be judged in righteousness. You're going to be judged based on what you have done, whether you've been obedient to Christ or not. And if you're apart from God, that fate is not very good. But we do have assurance, as Paul said, verse 31, there is the recognition of salvation in judgment, because all men have been assured that Christ has been raised from the dead. And even though we do share common ground, we still have the same opportunity for salvation, is what Paul is emphasizing in this passage. And so Paul's really given us a good example of how we can essentially have a common experience, how we share in and how we can relate to other people by finding common ground. Again, Paul did it because he was willing to throw that wide blanket. He was willing to talk to people that he might not have had a lot of common interests with. He was willing to observe the actions and the beliefs and to listen to others that maybe he doesn't agree with. But because he gave that diligent attention, he now preaches a sermon, verses 23 down through verse 31, in which he acknowledges that common ground. And by acknowledging that common ground, Paul's not coming with a strong rod of correction to harshly rebuke them, but it's a message of encouragement that, even though I may be different from you, there are some similarities. And that common ground really all points us to being obedient to Christ if we want to be eternally saved. Now we do note that some did not believe. Verse 32, some, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some of them did mock. And there were others, though, that wanted to hear again. Paul would hopefully be given the opportunity to preach again. But verse 34, again, certain men clave unto him and believed, among the which was Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. And these, by the way, are not Jews, right? The Areopagite was a member of the Athenian Supreme Court, we might say. These are people that are not coming from a Jewish background. But now, these people in verse 34 have been saved because Paul has done all of these things. He's found common ground, and he's taken that common ground to point to Jesus as the ultimate means of being saved. And hopefully this is a sermon in which we can think about, how Paul found common ground, how we can find common ground with other people today. If we're willing to talk to people and we're willing to listen to what they have to say, we can find common ground. And really the ultimate point of conclusion is, whenever I can relate to others, I have a better chance of saving others. And that's exactly what Paul has done in Acts 17. He came from a very different background, but he took the time to try to relate to other people. And by the end of the chapter, verse 34, that paid off with the several individuals that were saved and were obedient to the gospel. This morning, I cannot be a part of that group. I cannot be a part of the church if I have not obeyed as God has instructed. The Bible is very clear that I have to hear the word of Jesus, or hear the Bible, hear the word of God. I have to believe in Jesus. I then have to repent of my sins and then confess that Christ is the Son of God, and that I am willing to be baptized for the remission of my sins, so that my sins are washed away and I can have a home in heaven with God. But after that, I can lose my salvation. I can fall back into a lost state. But fortunately, I can have the prayers made for the forgiveness of those sins by members of the church. And in that sense, I can be forgiven and restored to the New Testament church once again. This morning, if you have any need, won't you come while we stand and while we sing.